systematic murder, torture, or rape doesn't amount to parking violations. Let's get real. These are the most serious crimes under law. So I wouldn't make too much of the fact that while the prosecutor wanted genocide charges, the court has found crimes against humanity, which are, again, torture, murder, rape on a widespread basis committed as part of a plan.
Practically speaking, what would this indictment mean in terms of actually bringing al-Bashir into a courtroom? Either, obviously, he would have to be arrested in international travel, or there has to be a change of government there for him to be actually brought to justice, no?
Well, I think, Juan, you have touched on, and Alex referred to, what is the well-known Achilles heel of all of these international courts. None of them, unlike the court right around the corner here, has its own police force to enforce its arrest warrants and judicial orders. Nonetheless, we have seen in many diverse situations, ranging from Slobodan Milosevic, Charles Taylor, Radovan Karadzic, the apprehension of individuals. I mention those examples not to simplify and suggest that the situation in Serbia or Liberia is exactly the same as the one in Sudan, and I think Alex has made in his writings important distinctions, but nonetheless, all of these individuals have ultimately been apprehended. I think that will occur with Omar al-Bashir, and possibly we will see, and I say possibly, I'm not clairvoyant, a process of marginalization politically for Omar al-Bashir.
Professor Alex de Waal.
Ultimately, yes, very likely President Bashir will face some process of justice, but there is no mechanism. And an internal coup d'etat in the Sudanese government, I don't think would be a very good idea, not least because the people who might mount it are themselves cut from exactly the same cloth and have been involved in precisely the same sorts of activities as the president over recent years. Any other form of change in government by the military opposition would unleash a new war. So there is no mechanism for apprehending this fellow now. Meanwhile, there is a very complex negotiated transition to a democratic system in Sudan. There is a comprehensive peace agreement between the government in the north, headed by Omar al-Bashir, and the former southern rebels who've been brought into a government of national unity, ending more than 20 years of war. It's a very fragile, very difficult process. And that process requires cooperation between the existing government, its partners in government, the former rebels from the south, the SPLM, and the international community. And it's very unclear to me how the very difficult negotiated transitions, elections, etc., can proceed under these circumstances. There is, I think, also a very serious downside risk to the prospects of democratization and peace in Sudan as a whole, for the prospect of, as Richard says, ultimately bringing this one individual to court. So that's why I think the timing is poor. I think that this man is not going to be facing justice now. This is really a symbolic action. And why not postpone this until such time as the immediate crises have passed and the prospects of renewed war, of a reversion to dictatorship, etc., have been dealt with, have been put aside.
And Alex de Waal, what about the criticism raised by some that these international tribunals seem always to target weak or marginalized governments and don't go after, for example, in the Indonesian atrocities in Timor or the American atrocities in the Iraq War and its war on terror?
Well, I think this is something that the International Criminal Court needs to be very careful about, because in the initial days when it was set up, African governments, African peoples were great enthusiasts for the ICC, and more than half of the nations that became the first signatories to the Rome Statute that set up the court were from Africa. 3 of the first 4 cases were referred by Africans. But Africa is now beginning to have serious second thoughts about the court. The African Union is strongly objecting to this arrest warrant. And of course, a lot of this comes down to sheer self-interest. They don't want the court looking too closely at what they themselves are doing. But part of it is a sense that the court has double standards and that there's a neo-colonial enterprise afoot. Personally, I don't see much evidence for that, but the perception of it, I think, is very important. And I think that if the court is really to have credibility, particularly in Africa, it needs to do a lot more work to support local national processes of justice, and to be much more sensitive to the demands of Africans, that it works with them rather than being seen as some sort of alien imposition from outside.
Let's end on that point with Richard Dicker as well. David Crane, the former prosecutor in the special tribunal that indicted Liberian President Charles Taylor, says the same principles that led to Bashir's indictment could be used against Bush on the issue of torture.
Well, I think that really what is happening here is an extension of the reach of law. What applies for Bashir needs to apply for the leaders of the most powerful governments when they are implicated in these same kinds of crimes, and when, as has been the case in Sudan, the national courts, whose job it is first and foremost, as Alex is rightly suggesting, have failed to do that investigation and prosecution. And I think where we're going with this whole international justice enterprise is towards a point in which it's not only African leaders or Serbian leaders. And I will agree with Alex, and I think he accurately flags the danger of perception. But where we need to move this ball down the field is that the Putins and the Bushes, for example, are just as much at risk for these kinds of international prosecutions as the leaders in Sudan or Liberia, etc.
We're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, Richard Dicker, very much for being with us of Human Rights Watch, as well Alex de Waal at Harvard University. Among his books, Darfur, A New History of a Long War. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org.